1820s. He goes up to the top. It's the tallest building in Paris. And Louis XVIII, he is briefly King of France in the 1820s. He is out at his estate at Versailles, and he is something like 12 miles away. And one night when, he's partying, doing the kinds of things kings of France do, one of his aides says, Monsieur, if you would please look back at Paris. We've arranged for a special scientific demonstration. If you just turn your head to the left, you will notice that there is a light coming from Paris, like 12 miles away that you can see. He turns, he sees it, and lo and behold, it is that single lantern that Fresnel has on top of the Arc de Triomphe. And it was pretty amazing. The king said, that is amazing. You can amplify light to that degree. Let's fund this guy's research. And so they put it to practical use. This is a lighthouse at a place called Cordovan. That is in like the Bay of Biscay. It's down here by Bordeaux. There's a little island right there. This is a huge lighthouse, to give you an idea. There's a guy standing on it, so if that gives you an indication of how big of a lens. But this was the real practical purpose. I know this is a tangent, but I couldn't help but show you guys. You must all be lighthouse enthusiasts. This is what the inside of this lighthouse looks like. They built this for a king. It's made out of marble. It has marble floors. There's actually a chapel inside because they had this kind of strange idea that the king might come visit them at their lighthouse and stay, so they had to have a chapel so the king could attend church services. Pretty ornate building. But a huge success. This proves very popular. Sailors see this. In fact, to this day, at the base of every lighthouse in the country of France, there's a statue of Augustin Fresnel. Unfortunately, Fresnel, he dies in his 30s from tuberculosis, so he dies young. It's one of those what-ifs of what he might have accomplished. But this takes off like wildfire. All throughout Europe, people begin using these Fresnel lenses. The Fresnel lenses kind of look like this. This is actually a later picture of the US. They don't catch on in the United States for basically a few decades. Now let's tie these threads together, those people we talked about. Stephen Pleasanton, the man who knows nothing about lighthouses, he starts getting reports from sailors, because sailors obviously are going to other countries and coming back, and they're like, how come we can see all the lighthouses in France great, and when we get back to the United States, it's terrible? And they're complaining, so we should get the same lights they have in Europe. And Fresnel, Pleasanton says, nah, it's too expensive to buy those. He has a deal with Winslow Lewis. Winslow Lewis is that man who invented that lamp that he is selling to the federal government. Not only is he selling that lamp, he has secured the contract to also deliver the oil, which I have to imagine is a bit of a conflict of interest, because he didn't really have any kind of incentive to find something that burned more efficiently, because if you're selling somebody the car and the gas, you don't really care what kind of mileage it gets. And this is what happens. Stephen Pleasanton for decades says, well, it's cheaper setup for those Lewis lamps, even though over the long term they work worse and they are more expensive in terms of fuel. In fact, if you make the upfront investment into something like a Fresnel lens like this, they're very efficient in terms of the fuel you burn. So it actually eventually comes to a congressional hearing in the 1850s when they're finally able to oust Pleasanton after decades, and the United States gets Fresnel lenses just like these. They are arranged in order from first order all the way down to sixth order. So sixth order lenses are like this. First order lenses like barely fit on this stage. They are huge, very impressive if you ever get a chance to see one. There are some that are even custom built. This is one out in Hawaii that you can see. Massive, massive lens. So we have talked a little bit about lighthouse technology. Let's get on to how this applies to Michigan. That is what this is kind of all about after all. Most lighthouses in Michigan were built with that Fresnel lens technology. Any of the ones that were built after the 1850s, and of course the ones that were built before that were modified to use it. So in Michigan, there's a huge need for lighthouses. If you think about Michigan, the Anishinaabe, the indigenous people of Michigan have lived here since time immemorial, and they get around by water. It's kind of a no-brainer in Michigan with the number of rivers and lakes. It's the best way to get around. But obviously, if you are in a birch bark canoe and you can kind of pop up on land wherever you want, you're probably rarely out of sight of the land. The Odawa are kind of known as like, they're the very brave ones who will occasionally go out of the sight of land on their canoes, take a big risk and cut across one of the lakes. But very rarely are you even out of the sight of land, and you can pull up. There's no need for a lighthouse. Lighthouse is really for a ship that requires a harbor somewhere so they don't ground out when they're coming up. The canoes become bigger after Europeans arrive in the 16th century. This is a canoe de maitre. It's about 40 feet long. You can haul 3 tons of goods. They took this indigenous technology. They said it works great. Let's make it bigger. Sailing does come pretty early to Michigan, too. This is a I guess, an idea of what Le Griffin looks like. This is the first sailing vessel on the Great Lakes, 1679. Pro tip, every year, like clockwork, you will see a story that someone has definitely found it this time. No, they haven't. I'm just going to save you time right now. I hate to disappoint anyone. They're not going to find this. It's completely gone. But every year, you're going to see somebody. I hope I get to eat my words someday. But this was the first sailing vessel that actually sank on its inaugural sail in 1679. But sailing came on the Great Lakes. The real big thing comes in the 1820s. By the 1820s, you have the advent of not only steam power, so this is Walk in the Water, the first steam vessel on the Great Lakes. You have the completion of the Erie Canal. So now ships can come all the way up from New York, get onto the Great Lakes, come back out, trade in cruise booms. Michigan very quickly, becomes a state not too long afterwards. And you see, with the huge boom in shipbuilding, there is an immediate cry saying, we need more lighthouses in the state. If you're going to have hundreds of ships, if not thousands operating, we need lighthouses to operate here safely. So that's how the proliferation of these lighthouses really start at about that time. This is a great postcard I scanned and kind of blew up here. I know it's maybe a little blurry on the stage, but you can all recognize the state, and you can all recognize just the sheer number of lighthouses all around our coastlines. We have more than any other state, which is, I think, really cool. I think sometimes the coastal elites will think about their very tall lighthouses and forget that Michigan has so many here on the Great Lakes. I know the tall lighthouse comes up a lot. It's kind of an interesting thing. One of the reasons you think about a height for a lighthouse, the ocean is a little bit different than the Great Lakes. Both are obviously massive, bodies of water. But on the ocean, there's a very gentle slope in most places out towards the end of kind of the continental shelf. So a lot of large ships are going to be much further away from shore because it's so shallow for such a long time. I know some people go to the ocean and you can walk a couple hundred yards out and still be like only up to your waist if it's a really, shallow place. How many of you have gone swimming in, one of the Great Lakes? You come up to, Lake Huron and you go out 300 yards, it's going to be like 200 feet deep. It's very, very sharp decline. So as a result, on the oceans, the ships are further away from shore, so the lighthouses are taller. On the Great Lakes, the ships are quite frequently closer to shore, so the lighthouses don't have to be built as tall. So that's one of the big differences. And it wasn't actually until a recent trip that I made to St. Augustine before I was kind of able to put all that together in my mind. I just thought like, well, ocean's bigger, taller lighthouse, but it actually has nothing to do with the size, because with both the ocean and the Great Lakes, you can only see the lights so many miles out to sea. It doesn't really matter how big the entire body of water is. All right, so the first lighthouse I want to talk about is actually the first lighthouse in the state of Michigan. It is Fort Gratiot Light. So Fort Gratiot was actually built by Winslow Lewis, that name I told you about. So not only does he get the contract to build lenses and supply fuel, he also frequently gets contracts from Stephen Pleasanton to build lighthouses. And he's pretty bad at it. The first lighthouse he builds in Port Huron in 1825, what would become Port Huron, only stays up for about 4 years before it blows down in a storm. It was also so poorly situated that sailors said they could not see the light until they had already entered the St. Clair River from Lake Huron, which kind of rendered the whole thing pointless. So when they rebuild the light, they actually re-site it. Congress allocates about $5,000 to build this. There's a lot of money in the 1820s, and so since 1829, we've had the Fort Gratiot Light. And here you can see this is Lake Huron right here. There's the Blue Water Bridge, and there is the St. Clair River, very, very fast river. But been a popular place for people to visit for many, many years. We'll quickly see some lighthouses are probably a better lighthouse to be stationed at than others. I would put the Fort Gratiot Light pretty high on the list of nice places that you would want to be stationed if you were a lighthouse keeper. In fact, it's kind of funny, in the rules to lighthouse keepers that comes out by the 1880s, in fact, you were required, and this was true of all lighthouses in Michigan, all lighthouses across the United States, you were required to be kind and courteous to all visitors to the lighthouse and show them around when they showed up. So that was one of the jobs of the lighthouse keeper. So we can see there's the early duplex. We know that the federal government not only builds these towers, they also build the place for the people to live. In 1829, there was really no city of Port Huron at the time. There was no great place for a keeper to live, so they get a house. And you'll notice the house is detached. That's one of the other things you can tell about a lighthouse in Michigan, a quick way to judge its age. If the dwelling of the lighthouse is detached, it's more likely to be an earlier lighthouse. And think about it from Congress's perspective. They said, if we hire some lighthouse keeper and he, forgets that he put bacon on the stove and he burns his house down, We really don't want to lose our $5,000 investment in that tower. So separate the house, because we don't care if his house burns down ultimately, like he could live in a tent, but don't let him burn that tower down. That was very expensive to build and engineer. So you'll see separate housing quarters from the actual tower itself. That's what you see here in the 1870s as well, a duplex. Another building that is common to many lighthouses across the state is a fog signal station. How many of you have ever experienced fog on the Great Lakes? Pretty common. That can happen one way or another. You can have the brightest light in the whole country, but if there's dense fog and you can only have 20 foot of visibility, well, that's not going to do you any good. So fog signals were popular. The earliest fog signals were simply things like a bell. There were a couple lighthouses that even used like a cannon they would set off every couple minutes. It sounds fun, but there was frequently a bell that you might hit with a hammer every 30 seconds. When we get field trips that come visit the lighthouse, I tell them that, and I ask the kids, who here wants to hit this bell as hard as you can with a hammer every 30 seconds? They're very excited until I tell them, like, okay, well, you have to keep doing it for as long as the fog's around, which could be a couple hours. And enthusiasm tends to wane a little bit after that. The fog signal building here, you can actually see has a really tall smokestack. That's usually how you could tell a fog signal station. And it's because a lot of them used steam power. So they would have a boiler, they would build a fire, build up the steam to run air whistles, so steam whistles. Steam whistles sound like when Fred Flintstone gets out of work, the big whistle the guy pulls. That's what they would blow, every 30 seconds, something like that. Eventually, there was a problem. Fog can come and go so quickly that it sometimes was impossible to build up steam by the time the fog has arrived, and by the time you have the steam, the fog's gone. So I eventually switched to compressed air. This is a photo from the 1930s. Many of these were standard equipment across the Great Lakes. They would have small engines running an air compressor, and they would use compressed air to blow the horns. They eventually switched to a diaphone, which is a sound you have all heard as well. They go from the steam whistle to the diaphone, the two different tones. It's great at setting the scene when you go down to the docks, you're investigating a crime. There's always one of those going off in the background, right? So the fog signal, this is an example of one of those steam whistles and air diaphone systems. Just a picture, again, of kind of the whole complex there. So most of these lighthouses, sometimes we think of a lighthouse, are actually quite a bit more than a lighthouse. They're an entire light station. One more quick aside about the Fort Gratiot light, because it is my favorite, and I wrote the presentation, so I got to pick what to talk about. It has a green light. This is very uncommon. Most lights are either white or red. Those are the two colors that you can see the furthest away. But there are rare instances where you might use a green light. One of those instances are in a place where you have a lot of lighthouses in a very close proximity. Great example is like the Straits of Mackinac, where you have over a dozen lighthouses within a 20-mile circle, because there are so many inlets and places to put them. Every lighthouse needs to look unique in both a day marking, so when you see it, you know which one you're looking at, and they also have to have a unique light signature. So that's the type of light that's going to maybe flash once every 6 seconds, or it'll flash twice and then be off for 10 seconds. Or maybe it's a continuous sweep. That's kind of a famous one that's always on and sweeping. But you want to be able to look and tell at night. If there's a bunch of lighthouses you can see on the horizon, it'd be very confusing if they all had the same light signature and you couldn't tell one from another. The other reason you might wind up with a green one, so you could use green to differentiate it. In Port Huron, you can see in the background here, there's a great big water tower, some heavy industry. There's a paper company that actually just went out of business a couple weeks ago, nearly 100 years old, called Dunn Paper. And they had a rail spur that came to pick up the paper. And even back in the 1930s, when they electrified the light at Fort Gratiot, sailors said, well, when we're looking in that direction, right behind the lighthouse is this paper factory. If the train comes in, it's got a bright headlight. And then all of a sudden, we don't know which one's the lighthouse, which one's the headlight, and the headlight's moving, and you're bobbing up and down on a boat. You don't want to be trying to figure out which one of these is actually the lighthouse. So they eventually said, all right, trains don't use a green light because they have the red light on the caboose. We'll put a green light on the Fort Gratiot station. So it has a green lantern, which is pretty cool. Small plug, if anybody does want to come spend an overnight at the light, it's pretty fun. So moving down the river just a little bit, there's another type of light that I want to talk about, that there is another great example in Port Huron nearby, and it's a range light. These are also pretty common. Sometimes you see a range light. The way a range light works, so there's actually two of them. There's one here, and there's one back there. Sometimes these were not even manned. Sometimes they're like this. They're simply, kind of reflectors. These are automated. These were actually built in the 90s. They're really nice because they kind of match like the condos that were developed here. Before this, they were much more industrial, just like metal posts. But the way a range light works, if you are coming into a river that moves around a lot and you need to line up your 1,000-foot freighter to make sure you're entering this curvy river at the right angle, you use these just like the sights on a rifle. So this one in the back is actually taller than the one in the front. You wait until they are lined up. Once they are both in a line, you know you're on the right angle of approach. So there are actually range lights all over the state as well. The St. Clair River, for instance, requires a pilot, as does much of the Detroit River. There are so many twists and turns. So they will run pilot boats out to those freighters to navigate those, and they know all about these range lights and how to look. Another kind of lighthouse that's kind of unique to Michigan, the Huron. Has anyone here ever seen the Huron or been on board? So the Huron is actually a light ship. There are places in the Great Lakes and on the eastern coast, although they were actually more common on the Great Lakes, where it was not economical or very difficult, or there were engineering challenges in building an actual permanent lighthouse. And so what they do is they stick a lighthouse on a boat, and you sail the boat out to wherever the danger is, you mark it, and you just anchor it there for the whole shipping season. So for example, the Huron here marked the Corsica shoals, which were just underwater. So the big freighters would definitely run into them, but they are invisible above the water. This would sit on the edge of where those shoals were and guide the ships around it. They're called the Corsica shoals. There's a bit of a seafaring tradition. If you were a seafaring captain back in the wooden ship days, you're sailing along and all of a sudden you just hear like crunch, crack, and you've hit one of these shoals and there's a huge hole in your boat. Now you're going down and you get on the lifeboat and you had no idea you were going to hit that. And you're sitting there in the lifeboat shivering and cold. You have one thing that will probably warm your mind, and that's the fact that they're going to name the shoals after the ship you just sunk. So that's the silver lining. The Corsica was the first ship to hit the Corsica shoals. So sometimes if you see weird names, that's why. So the Huron worked until 1970, amazingly late. It was the last light ship on the Great Lakes. It's kind of crazy to think that just a little over 50 years ago, it was still more economical to send 6 guys out on a little boat for 9 months out of the year to just warn people like, watch out, please watch out, please watch out, please watch out on this boat. Very boring work, by the way. This boat's only 92 feet long, but it's now anchored as a museum ship in Port Huron. And there's the light itself. You can see it all the way up here. All right, so this is, how many of you have seen this movie? Like 2 of you. I'm going to recommend it, okay? And please, don't blame me if you watch it and hate it. But this is actually kind of a psychological horror thriller movie. There's not a lot of jump scares. It's not, anything like that. It's more about the experience of like 2 men living on a tiny island with a lighthouse, and one of them might be crazy. And it's kind of fun. I'll let you guess which one might be crazy. So this movie is called The Lighthouse, by the way. It came out just a few years ago. It's black and white, so it's kind of an art feeling to it. But it's a new movie. It's Robert Pattinson. And great movie. So what I think of with this is there's a lighthouse in Michigan, probably my second favorite lighthouse. It's a place called Stannard Rock. Stannard Rock is one of those lighthouses. Port Huron's a nice place to be stationed. Stannard Rock is the worst place in the world to be stationed. Because if you actually look, so this is the Keweenaw Peninsula. Down here, there's Marquette. How many of you been up to the Keweenaw before? A few people? It's pretty remote. It's a long trip up there. Stannard Rock is actually like 30 miles north of Marquette, all the way up here. It is in the middle of nowhere. A lot of people have actually called it the most isolated place on Earth. It is certainly the most isolated place in the Western Hemisphere. The fact that when you get on this island, this little lighthouse that they have built, it's called a crib light. That's called the crib down there. You are out of the sight of land. You are like 30 miles from land. And even if you get to land, the 30 miles are very rural Keweenaw Peninsula. You're more likely to run into a bear than another person. So very, very remote. So this was one of those places that's maybe not pleasant to stay. You can see it's stacked. There are rooms right on top of each other. So your room, the living quarters were here in the middle. So even if you weren't actively working, the guys who were would be constantly walking through your room saying, oh, excuse me, just me, going back down to the kitchen, walking through your tiny little room. These are not very big. That's a picture of inside what this tiny tower would look like. And if you can imagine being there and the kinds of weather conditions you might experience at a place like Stannard Rock. There was one season, it was even in the 1920s, so relatively recent, only 100 years ago, where at the end of the season, the weather was so foul on Lake Superior, they couldn't get a boat out to them. And they got stuck for an additional 3 weeks. They almost ran out of food. And the Coast Guard knew, like, they're out there, we got to bring them in, and they have, like, they're down to their last, like, tin of beans, but we can't get a boat out to them. There's, like, 30-foot waves. It's too dangerous. So that's the kind of conditions that they would live with. Not a pleasant place to go at all. It kind of maybe be cool to poke around for an hour or two, but there was a lot of stories of Coast Guardsmen who, if you decided to take this, it was manned until the 1960s, if you agreed to spend a season here, where you would hopefully spend, a few weeks on, go back, a few weeks off, because they would run mail and supplies out every couple weeks and rotate a crew member, that if you spent a season here, you got to pick where you could go the next season. Any station in the world for the Coast Guard. So there's a lot of guys who would risk it, especially, some young single men who would wind up here just because their next post could be Miami Beach, So I don't know if that's worth it. Maybe, you'd have to ask one of them. They did find ways to try and fight boredom. This is actually a U.S. Lighthouse Establishment Library. I always like to bring these up at a library because obviously self-selecting group, not only do you like lighthouses, you're here at a library, one of society's best institutions. So they bring a traveling library like this in a little pine box. It has a mix of books, comedy, science, religion, you name it. There was just a little bit of everything, and they would rotate these around throughout the year so you could always have something to read. I know some people, my wife included, she would love to actually just spend a summer with a box of a library on a little island and not talk to anyone else and just earn her books. So let's talk about another lighthouse over on the west side of the state. This is, anybody know? This is Big Red, pretty easy name to remember. This is actually in Holland. I got a chance to go here and take a few pictures. This was last year. Most people get pictures from the other side. It's actually hard to tell, but there's actually water out here. This is where the channel to go into Holland is. And this side is notoriously difficult to get to. There's a couple of giant mansions, and in fact, the day we went there, we got harassed by a security guard with a gun who was I think it was one of the DeVosses on a giant home there and don't want anyone walking by it. Even though this is perfectly acceptable to go out to. We were having a meeting with the Lighthouse Alliance, lighthouse enthusiasts, and there's lawsuits ongoing. But so very lucky to get to actually see it in person and see it on this side. But this is actually a lighthouse where no one lives. So there was actually small workstations here, but the lighthouse keepers lived inland about a mile away or so. But another very iconic lighthouse. This is one that has a very iconic day mark. You can tell it instantly as a day mark. That's the color it is in the day. You can't mistake this for any other tower. This is actually a picture of my wife and I. Well, my wife, when we went there, was very excited to find lots of drawings of Fresnel lenses. They're her favorite thing in the world. I didn't even think about taking the pictures for the presentation, but you get what you get. So, and this is a picture of us up in the top at the lighthouse here. Yeah, you can see there's actually a little path here that totally takes you back to town until you run into the armed security guard right around that corner. He says, you're not allowed to go here. And we're like, this is a public sidewalk. And, the guy with the gun wins. So, anyway, great example of one of those famous West Side lighthouses. All right, so I want to talk about another type of lighthouse. This is another crib light. This is Wagashans, another one with a great day mark. It's got this red and white stripe. It's actually metal cladding. It was originally built with brick. They cladded it with metal because up in the Straits the winters are so harsh. And this has a fascinating story. So Wagashans is sadly a lighthouse that became supplanted. White Shoal was built. That's the really famous one. We'll talk about that in a second. This one kind of became useless, and the federal government had something very interesting going on. World War II. During the Second World War, there's obviously a need to train all sorts of sailors, aviators, the like. So they actually commissioned a couple of aircraft carriers right here on the Great Lakes to train pilots. A lot easier to train them in the Great Lakes where they're really at no risk besides crashing, but they're not going to crash in enemy territory or out in the ocean or something like that. You're on the lakes. So with the Sable and the Wolverine, they had aircraft carriers. They were training naval pilots, guys, bombers like this. There's actually some pretty famous people trained here. Anybody recognize this guy? That is George H.W. Bush, was a naval pilot who trained on the Great Lakes here. So one of the things they did, though, is they would take off from kind of the middle of Lake Michigan. They'd send these guys out. They've got to practice diving on